Where is the center of the world? The Silk Roads, From Faith to Black Gold. A book that keeps Western historians awake at night. Welcome to the Deep Sight podcast channel. I am your navigator through time, Lawrence Stardust. In our last episode, we followed in the footsteps of Will Durant and completed that 40-year marathon of civilization. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the banners of Napoleon, Durant used 11 volumes to tell us that civilization is a relay race originating in the East and passing westward. He cared about the soul deep within every mind of civilization, how the Greeks debated justice, how the Romans wove law, how Renaissance painters captured on canvas the clash between divinity and humanity. But Durant's map has a natural blind spot. His gaze remained fixed on the interior of civilization, how a civilization's economy, politics, ethics, and art interacted and rose and fell. That vast connective tissue between civilizations, the corridor through which ideas, goods, germs, and faiths flowed, appears in his narrative only as background, only as a hallway, only as a passageway from one stage of civilization to the next. But what if this corridor itself is the stage? What if those caravans, slaves, translators, and nomadic cavalry that Durant glossed over are the true protagonists of history? Today, the extraordinary book I am bringing you will completely flip the map in your hands. It will tell you that for 2,000 years, the center of the world was never in London, Paris, or Washington, but in a zone that modern Westerners have deliberately or unconsciously forgotten. Stretching from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean all the way to Xi'an in China, from the shores of the Black Sea to the Hindu Kush mountains, from the Persian Gulf to the Central Asian steppe, that vast hinterland loosely called the Silk Road. This book is The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. Its author, Peter Frankopan, is a senior research fellow at Worcester College, Oxford, and director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research. He is no media celebrity, but a scholar who has immersed himself for 30 years in Middle Eastern manuscripts, Greek documents, and Byzantine archives. When it was published in 2015, the book shook the Euro-American historical world, was named Book of the Year by the Times, translated into more than 30 languages, and sold over 1 million copies. But what truly shakes the reader is not its sales, but its ambition. Frankopan wants to use a single book to set right a world history that has been upside down for 500 years. Today, let us enter this map-flipping epic of civilization. I don't just want to tell you what it says, any book review can do that. I want to take you deep into its texture, to see which corners its light illuminates and which shadows it leaves behind, to see where it is deafeningly clear and where it is conspicuously silent. And most importantly, I want to answer a question with you. In this era of barriers, decoupling, and confrontation, how should we read this book correctly, so that we are neither intoxicated by its subversiveness nor blinded by its limitations? Departure. What kind of road is the Silk Road? The formation of the Silk Road was not opened by any single person on any single day, but was the result of a gradual connection that lasted thousands of years. It is more like a network trodden out by countless caravans, nomadic tribes, envoys, and explorers, rather than a planned road. To understand its origins, we need to turn the clock back to 2000 BCE or even earlier, and see how the peoples of the Eurasian landmass were connected step by step. Phase 1. The prehistoric steppe corridor, 2000 to 500 BCE. Before the name Silk Road existed, the Eurasian continent already had a steppe road. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as around 2000 BCE, bronze smelting technology, wheat cultivation, and the domestication of sheep and horses had already spread from Mesopotamia and the Central Asian steppe eastward to northwest China. At sites such as the Gumagu Cemetery in Xinjiang and the Qijia culture in Gansu, traces of wheat and bronze artifacts from the west have been found. At the same time, Hetian jade, Kunlun jade, began to flow westward with a prototype of the later Jade Road. This corridor existed not because of any imperial decree, but because the Eurasian steppe belt, stretching from the Hungarian plains to the Mongolian plateau, was a continuous open zone. Nomadic peoples rode horses, herded flocks, and migrated seasonally across the grasslands, unintentionally becoming the earliest couriers. They exchanged not only goods, but also technology, language, and genes. Before the official Silk Road was born, the steppe was already an active information superhighway. Phase 2. The eastward expansion of the Hellenistic world, 4th century BCE. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great launched his eastern campaign. Within 10 years, the Macedonian king's armies had marched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River Valley, establishing a vast empire spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. Although Alexander's empire quickly fragmented after his death, it left a lasting legacy: the Hellenistic world. Greek became the common language from Egypt to Central Asia. Greek-style cities, such as Ai-Khanum in Afghanistan and Taxila in Pakistan, were founded in the East. Greek coinage, artistic styles, and scientific knowledge permeated eastward along these cities. At the same time, India's Mauryan Empire established contact with the Hellenistic world. It was during this period that Buddhism began to spread outward. The Hellenistic world laid the cultural infrastructure for later Silk Road trade, a common language, universal currency, and urban nodes. So Alexander did not open the Silk Road, but he opened a breach in the east with his sword, allowing later caravans and missionaries to pass through. Phase 3. Zhang Qian's Piercing the Void, 138 to 119 BCE. This is the most iconic event in Silk Road history and the official starting point in Chinese historical records. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu of Han, seeking to ally with the Yuezhi against the Xiongnu, dispatched Zhang Qian on a mission to the western regions. Zhang Qian's party set out from Chang'an, crossed the Hushi Corridor, was detained by the Xiongnu for 10 years, escaped, and continued westward to Diyin, modern Fergana Valley, Kangjiu, near modern Samarkand, and the Yuezhi. Zhang Qian's mission did not achieve its political goal of allied with the Yuezhi, but it triggered an information explosion. Emperor Wu learned for the first time in detail that beyond the Xiongnu lay a complex world of dozens of city-states and nomadic tribes, where there were heavenly horses, grapes, alfalfa, walnuts, and merchants willing to pay gold for silk. Before this, the Chinese emperor knew nothing of it. In 119 BCE, Zhang Qian set out a second time, leading a delegation of 300, carrying tens of thousands of rolls of silk and gold and silver, formally establishing official contact between the Han dynasty and the western region states. Thereafter, the Han established the four commanderies of Hushi, Wuwei, Zhengye, Jiuquan, Dunhuang, built the Great Wall, set up beacon towers, and garrisoned troops for farming. Sima Qian in the records of the Grand Historian used the term chuakam, piercing the void, to describe Zhang Qian's achievement, meaning carving open a passage through what was originally empty. But this needs to be viewed dialectically. What Zhang Qian carved open was not a new road, but an old road blocked by the Xiongnu. What he did was use Han state power to provide security and official endorsement for a trade route that had already existed among the people. Phase 4. The Xiongnu, Kushan, and Rome, the relay of three great empires. The Silk Road flourished not because the Han dynasty alone made it so, but because of the relay of multiple empires. The Xiongnu, though enemies of the Han, this steppe empire objectively played the role of steppe network organizer. The western regions under Xiongnu control were the hub of north-south trade routes. Even during wartime, trade never completely ceased. The Kushan Empire, 1st to 3rd century CE, established by the Yuezhi, ruling Central Asia and North India. The Kushans were Buddhist, and their territory sat at the crossroads of the Silk Road. Buddhism's transmission from India to China through Kushan territory relied heavily on this empire's stability. The Roman Empire. Romans had an almost insane craving for Eastern luxuries, especially silk. The Roman Senate repeatedly issued sumptuary laws forbidding men to wear silk, to little effect. According to Pliny the Elder, the Roman Empire lost as much as 100 million sesterces in gold and silver to the east, mainly India and China, annually. This demand was the economic engine that kept the Silk Road running. So the Silk Road was not a straight line from China to Rome, but a multi-node, multi-directional trade network. Goods traveling from China to Rome might pass through the hands of dozens of middlemen, changing hands, increasing in price, and transforming in Samarkand, Merv, Ctesiphon, and Palmyra. Phase 5. The birth of the name a Richthofen's invention. Ironically, the name Silk Road was not created until 1877. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen first used the term Seidenstrasse, Silk Road, in his work China to name this ancient trade route. He chose the name because silk was the most representative, most expensive, and most fascinating Chinese export to Westerners. But this name also created a lasting misconception. It made people think this road was mainly for transporting silk. In reality, silk was just one of many commodities. Equally important were spices, gems, glass, metals, medicines, slaves, and even more importantly, though invisible, religion, technology, language, and disease. So the earliest Silk Road was not designed, but shaped by demand and geography together. Geography provided the possibility. The continuity of the Eurasian steppe, the narrow passage of the Hushi Corridor, the passes of the Pamir Mountains, the oasis chains of the Darien Basin. Technology provided the capability, the domestication of the horse, the raising of the camel, chariot making, navigation. Empires provided security, Han garrison farming, Kushan stability, Roman demand. Greed provided the motive, the longing for silk, the obsession with spices, the pursuit of gold. It was never one road, but a web. It was never one way, but multidirectional. It was never peaceful, but filled with war, plunder, deceit, and betrayal. Yet it was precisely these imperfections that made it the most enduring connection in human history. As Peter Frankopan writes in his book, the Silk Road is not a line. It is a world. Station 1. A flipped map. Why is the world's heart in the East? Frankopan's motivation for writing this book stemmed from a long-standing puzzle he encountered while teaching at Oxford. He found that whenever he asked students to draw a world map, they would unconsciously place Europe in the center, the Americas on the left, and Asia on the right. This map, or what we now call the Mercator projection, was born in 16th century Flanders. It enlarges Europe, compresses the equatorial regions, and engraves Northern Hemisphere superiority into every modern person's spatial intuition. But when you come to the East, you find that their world maps place East Asia and the empty Pacific on the right, while the so-called center of the world becomes a marginal fringe. Frankopan asks, if we go back 2,000 years to the era when human civilization was most active, where should the center of that map be? The answer will blow your mind. Constantinople, Baghdad, Samarkand, Chang'an, Bamiyan, the bazaars of Samarkand, the Mogao caves of Dunhuang, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Frankopan's core argument is like a scalpel, precisely cutting into the blind spot of traditional historiography. The Silk Road Zone, a stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia all the way to China, is the true heart of human civilization. This is not a corridor between East and West. This is the main stage of world history. Europe, for most of history, was merely a marginal seat in the audience, a latecomer who only later grabbed a front-row seat. This forms a fascinating contrast with Durant. In the first volume of the Story of Civilization, Durant takes the East as his starting point, but his narrative center quickly shifts to Greece, Rome, and Western Europe. Durant's History of Civilization is a river flowing from east to west, with its source in the east, but its estuary in the west. Frankopan says, no, civilization is not a one-way river. It is a crossroads, an endless transit station, a hub where different civilizations meet, collide, intermingle, and depart anew. Frankopan's flip is not only spatial but also axiological. He challenges a deep-seated premise of Western historiography for 500 years, that the birth of the modern world was the result of internal European evolution, the natural fruit of Greek rationality, Roman law, Christian ethics, Renaissance humanism, and Enlightenment scientific spirit. Frankopan says this is a colossal illusion. The birth of the modern world was the result of the convergence, strategic interaction, and exchange of forces in the Silk Road Zone. Without Eastern silk and spices, Chinese silver, Arabic numerals, Persian poetry, and the Mongol relay network, there would have been no rise of Europe. The subversiveness of this argument lies in the fact that it is not merely supplementing Eurocentrism, but replacing it. Frankopan is not adding a few Eastern chapters to the margins of Western historiography. He is rewriting the entire history of the world with Central Asia and the Middle East as its axis. Station 2. The Road of Faith. How did gods transfer on the Silk Road? Frankopan's book is not organized by chronology, but by roads. This structure itself carries meaning. History is not a straight line, but a giant web woven by roads. And the first road is the road of faith. We usually assume that religions spread top-down, from center to periphery, the Roman Curia dispatching missionaries, Buddhist monasteries sending monks, Islamic caliphates expanding territory. But Frankopan shows us another picture. On the Silk Road, the spread of religion was more like an impromptu performance without a director. Believers, merchants, exiles, and soldiers were all actors, and the trade routes were the stage. Before Christianity became the state religion of Rome, its early spread depended deeply on the trade networks of the Middle East. Jesus was born in Jerusalem. Paul preached among the towns of Asia Minor, and the earliest churches were established in Antioch and Edessa, not European cities, but hubs on the Silk Road. Christianity spread eastward even faster than westward. Nestorian Christianity reached Chang'an in the 7th century and held a place in the Tang court. While European monks were still copying Latin Bibles, Central Asian Christians were already preaching along the Silk Road in Syriac, Sogdian, and Chinese. Even more interesting is Buddhism. In the 3rd century BCE, the Indian Emperor Ashoka dispatched envoys to spread the faith westward. Buddhism entered Central Asia along the Silk Road and then reached China. But during the same period, Zoroastrianism radiated outward from Persia, Manichaeism attempted to fuse all religions into a universal faith, and Nestorian Christianity moved eastward. In the library cave of Dunhuang, archaeologists discovered Buddhist, Manichaean, and Christian manuscripts written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, and Sanskrit, collected by the same monks in the same cave. This hybridity of faith, in Frankopan's view, is the source of civilizational vitality, not the root of chaos. Frankopan writes about a theme that Durant almost completely ignored. Religion is not the boundary of civilization, but its connector. On the Silk Road, different faiths were not isolated islands, but rivers that permeated, competed, and fused with one another. Zoroastrianism influenced Jewish eschatology. Jewish monotheism influenced Christianity and Islam. Buddhist concepts of karma influenced Central Asian Gnosticism. Without this transfer of faiths, there would be no pure religions as we later knew them. But here lies the first seed of caution. Is Frankopan's praise of religious hybridity overly romanticized? Religious fusion often accompanies violence. The Crusades, the Inquisition, Islamic Jihad, armed Buddhist monasteries. When Frankopan writes about the road of faith, it reads more like a history of religious exchange than a history of religious conflict. His praise of faith fusion is sincere, but his treatment of the brutality of faith conflict is conspicuously thin. Station 3. The Road of Slaves is the blood-red network hidden from view. Frankopan does not shy away from the dark side of history. He devotes an entire chapter to the Road of Slaves. But this is not the familiar Atlantic triangular trade. It is an earlier, vaster, and more enduring Eurasian slave network. From the 8th century onward, the steppe regions of Central Asia and Eastern Europe became the main source of slaves. Vikings transported Slavs along rivers to the Black Sea. Arab merchants carried slaves from East Africa and Central Asia to Baghdad and Samarkand. Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate housed hundreds of thousands of slaves from the Central Asian steppe, the East African coast, the Caucasus Mountains, and the Balkans. By the time of the Mongol Empire, this human trade had reached staggering proportions of Mongol armies. After conquering each city, distributed craftsmen and young men and women as slaves to generals and soldiers. Frankopan coldly points out, the Silk Road was not only a channel for spices and silk, but also a pipeline of human suffering. To what extent was the splendor of Baghdad, the prosperity of Samarkand, and the wealth of Venetian merchants built upon the backs of slaves? Such scenes, history also calls civilization. But Frankopan's pen does not stop at moral condemnation. He pursues a deeper question. How did the slave trade reshape economic structures? To what extent was Baghdad's prosperity built on slave labor? How did the brutal conquests of the Mongol army accidentally open trade channels from the Pacific to the Mediterranean? Did the flow of slaves promote the spread of technology, as kidnapped craftsmen brought their skills to new lands? This is radically different from Durant's approach. When Durant writes about Rome, he writes about Caesar and Christ, about Senate debates and the blood of the arena. When Frankopan writes about the same period, he writes about those who have no names as slaves, merchants, translators, grooms, and how they constitute the underlying logic of history. In Frankopan's book, history is not a drama starring great men, but a network woven by countless anonymous people. How many of those heroes who yearn to have their names etched in history truly achieve it? And how many young people today, reading of these great glories, secretly sneer a million times in their hearts? Who cares? Of course, this bottom-up perspective comes at a cost. Though Frankopan's depiction of the road of slaves is shocking, his systematic analysis of slavery is not deep enough. He does not ask, why did some societies develop enduring slave systems while others did not? What is the economic difference between slavery and free labor? These questions require readers to supplement on their own. Station 4. The Mongol Empire are not destroyers, but super-routers. In traditional Western narratives, the Mongol Empire is usually depicted as barbarian destruction, an interruption of civilization, a deepening of the Dark Ages. But Frankopan offers a subversive view. The Mongol Empire was the first globalized empire in human history, the ultimate amplifier of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan and his descendants destroyed countless cities and slaughtered millions. This is fact and cannot be whitewashed. But they also did something unprecedented. They established a single security zone from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Within this zone, merchants could travel freely with passports. Pesa, the relay station system, Yam, connected every corner from Beijing to Baghdad, and ideas, technologies, diseases, and populations moved at unprecedented speeds. Frankopan mentions a striking detail. Under Mongol rule, a merchant could travel from Persia to China in less than a year, with security guaranteed along the way. This was unimaginable for 1,000 years before and after. The Mongols were not enemies of civilization. They were crude, efficient system administrators who integrated the previously dispersed Silk Road network into a super-local area network. This reversal of perspective is precisely what makes Frankopan so fascinating. He does not ask who conquered whom, but how did connection change everyone? Under Mongol rule, a Venetian merchant could walk to Beijing, a Chinese craftsman could walk to Baghdad, and a Persian astronomer could work in the Great Khan's court. This mobility, in contrast, disappeared during the later Ottoman Empire, Safavid Persia, and Mingqing China. But the question is, does Frankopan overly glorify the positive contributions of the Mongol Empire? He portrays the Mongols as system administrators who opened roads. But does he downplay the devastation of their conquests, the permanent destruction of Central Asian irrigation systems, the leveling of cities, the extermination of populations? Historian John Mann estimates in Genghis Khan that the Mongol conquests reduced Central Asia's population by about a third, and some regions took centuries to recover. Frankopan's network historiography inclines him to see the benefits of connection while paying insufficient attention to its costs, violence, oppression, ecological destruction. This is a pattern throughout the book. Frankopan excels at showcasing the dividends of trade and connection, but often glosses over the blood and tears behind those dividends. Life becomes an existence to be ignored. Station 5, the Black Death and Silver, the spread of disease, and the reshaping of economies. Frankopan's interpretation of the Black Death is also refreshingly novel because it completely flips the causal chain. In 1346, Mongol armies besieged the Crimean city of Kaffa, catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the walls of one of the earliest and most primitive forms of biological warfare in history. But Frankopan is not concerned with the siege itself. He is concerned with what happened next. The plague spread westward along the trade network built by the Mongols at a speed of several miles per day, eventually destroying 1/3 of Europe's population. But the other side of disaster is reshaping. The drastic reduction in labor forced Europe to reform its economic structure. Wages rose, technological innovation accelerated, serfdom collapsed, ultimately driving the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. Frankopan implies, without the Black Death, there would have been no later rise of Europe. And the path of the Black Death was precisely the path of the Silk Road. The super network established by the Mongol Empire spread not only goods and ideas, but also death. But if you had lived in that era, would you have accepted such social progress? By the 16th century, another force flowed in the opposite direction: silver. The massive quantities of silver mined by the Spanish at Potosí in the Americas did not remain in Europe, but flowed in large quantities into China through the Manila galleon trade. Frankopan points out, in the 16th to 18th centuries, China was the true engine of the global economy. The European colonial adventure in the Americas was, in a sense, merely an outsourcing service, providing currency for China. China needed silver to sustain its silver standard economy, and the output of American silver determined China's economic cycles. This argument is extraordinarily bold. It completely overturns the narrative of the rise of the West. It was not Europe that dominated the world, but the world's demand, especially China's demand, that shaped Europe's destiny. Without China's thirst for silver, the Spanish Empire might not have mined the Americas so frantically. Without the inflow of American silver, the Ming economy might not have prospered so much, nor collapsed so dramatically after the silver dried up. Here Frankopan demonstrates his acuity as an economic historian. But he also leaves a huge question mark. If China was the center of the global economy, why did the Industrial Revolution not occur in China? Why did technological breakthroughs appear in Europe rather than in Jiangnan, China's most developed region? Frankopan does not give a satisfactory answer. His network historiography excels at explaining flow and exchange, but shows its limitations when explaining innovation and breakthrough. Station 6. The Road of Black Gold, from imperial rivalry to the oil century. Entering the 19th century, Frankopan's narrative becomes more thrilling and more relevant to our own times. He writes about the Great Game, the spy wars, proxy wars, and territorial contests between Britain and Russia in Central Asia. This was not a marginal local conflict, but a life-and-death struggle between two empires for control of the Silk Road. Because whoever controlled Central Asia controlled the key to India and China. British explorers, cartographers, and spies, Russian Cossack cavalry and diplomats. They waged a war without gunpowder on these plateaus and deserts. Then the most significant variable of the 20th century appeared: oil. Frankopan devotes extensive space to showing how Middle Eastern oil reshaped the modern world. But once again, he flips the perspective. We usually assume that the West discovered Middle Eastern oil and therefore controlled it. But Frankopan points out that it was oil that returned the Middle East to the heart of the world. From Churchill's Royal Navy switching to oil power, to the outcome of both world wars depending on fuel supply, to the US-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War, to the Iraq War of the 21st century, every major turning point in the modern world had its pivot in that land Westerners call the Middle East. The final chapters of the book turn to the 21st century, the rise of Central Asia, America's strategic withdrawal, Russia's southward ambitions. Frankopan's conclusion is almost prophetic. The world is returning to its original shape. The center of gravity is shifting eastward, toward that hinterland connecting east and west. The Silk Road is not history, it is the future. This narrative that runs from antiquity straight to the present gives the book a strong sense of contemporary relevance. But critics point out that Frankopan's interpretation of contemporary politics is overly deterministic. He seems to imply that because of geography, great power rivalry is inevitable. But history tells us that human choice matters just as much. Is America's withdrawal from the Middle East inevitable? These are questions that geography cannot answer. Station 7. Frankopan's historiography through connection, not division. Having surveyed these roads, we must ask a deeper question. Through what kind of eyes does Frankopan view history? Compared with Durant's holistic historiography, Frankopan's can be summarized as network historiography. Durant sees history as a relay race of civilizations, focusing on how each civilization's internal economy, politics, ethics, and art interact and rise and fall. Frankopan sees history as a web of ceaseless interaction, focusing on the material flows, population migrations, technological exchanges, and power games between different civilizations. Durant's narrative is vertical. He delves into the interior of a civilization, dissecting its soul, reading its poetry, viewing its paintings, and listening to its philosophical debates. Frankopan's narrative is horizontal. He stands on the Central Asian plateau, watching how Eastern and Western forces collide, trade, and transform here, watching how caravans brought Indian numerals to Arabia, Chinese gunpowder to Europe, and Persian poetry to the Turks. Durant cares about the achievements of the human mind. Frankopan cares about the topology of human networks. There is no hierarchy between these two historiographies. If Durant's The Story of Civilization is a biography of civilization, then Frankopan's The Silk Roads is a traffic history of civilization. A biography tells you who this person is, how he thinks, how he feels. A traffic history tells you how this person relates to the world, what letters he receives, what goods he ships, whose germs he catches. But the problem lies precisely here. Frankopan's traffic history is brilliantly written, but the biography portion of civilization, those internal evolutions of faith, art, philosophy, and spirit, appears thin. He tells us that Buddhism reached Central Asia, but not how Central Asian Buddhists understood nirvana. He tells us that Greek philosophy reached the Arabs, but not how Arab philosophers transformed Aristotle. The connection is visible, but the chemical reaction after connection is often missing from the book. Station 8. Controversies and limitations. This key opens a door, but also casts shadows. Any subversive work will inevitably be accompanied by controversy. The Silk Roads is no exception. While we applaud Frankopan for flipping the map, we must also coolly examine. While this key opens one door, does it close other windows? First, the blind spot of materialism, when trade becomes the only grammar of history. Frankopan's most criticized trait is his tendency toward economic determinism. In the book's 25 chapters, the metaphor of roads is almost entirely occupied by trade, resources, currency, and geopolitical games. Silk, spices, slaves, silver, oil of these material flows constitute the skeleton of the narrative. Meanwhile, the internal evolution of thought, faith, art, and culture is often relegated to a supporting role. In Frankopan's book, the importance of Buddha and Socrates seems less than that of caravans and silver. Buddhism matters not because it offers a philosophy of suffering and liberation, but because it spread along the Silk Road and became a kind of cross-cultural commodity. Greek philosophy matters not because Plato's inquiry into ideas changed humanity's understanding of truth, but because Aristotle's works were preserved by Arab scholars and transmitted back to Europe. For readers who believe that ideas drive history, this perspective may seem overly materialist. Durant spent an entire chapter analyzing how Sophocles' tragedies reflected Greek thinking about fate. When Frankopan writes about the same period, he is more concerned with how Athens' silver mines funded its navy, and how that silver flowed into Persia. This is not a matter of right or wrong, but of perspective and choice. But when the choice becomes too extreme, history loses its soul. Humans are not ants who only trade. Humans die for faith, weep for a poem, and rebel against interest for the sake of justice. These dimensions are compressed to the margins in Frankopan's network historiography. Second, selective use of sources and narrative ethics, sacrificing complexity for the sake of argument. To support the grand narrative of the Silk Road as center, Frankopan is sometimes criticized for selectively using historical materials. His treatment of the Mongol Empire is a typical example. Frankopan emphasizes that the Mongol Empire promoted exchange, opened roads, and established the prototype of globalization. But he devotes noticeably little space to the devastation of Mongol conquest and the permanent destruction of Central Asian irrigation systems, the systematic leveling of cities, and the genocidal slaughter of populations. He writes about how the Mongols connected the world, but rarely about how they destroyed it. How long did it take Samarkand to recover after its massacre? How long was Central Asian scholarly tradition interrupted after the Mongol conquest? These questions find no answers in the book. Similarly, when writing about the glories of Islamic civilization, he lavishly praises the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, Arabic mathematics and medicine, but treats the expansionist wars of the Islamic empires, the taxation and persecution of non-believers, and internal sectarian conflicts relatively lightly. This is not to say that Frankopan is lying, but that he is selecting in order to maintain the positive image of the Silk Road as a civilizational connector. He tends to magnify the beautiful moments of exchange and minimize the bloody chapters of conflict. An honest historical work should allow readers to see both the dividends and the costs of connection. On this scale, Frankopan's weights clearly tip to one side. Third, the risk of overcorrection from Western-centrism to Eastern-centrism. Frankopan attempts to correct Western-centrism, but does he swing to another extreme, a kind of Eastern-centrism or Central Asian-centrism? In Frankopan's narrative, the unique role of Europe in the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and institutional innovation of the past 500 years is relativized. He implies that Europe's rise was mainly due to its position at the end of the Silk Road network, making it a receiver and transit station for Eastern technology and resources, rather than a creator. But this explanation cannot answer a core question. Why did the scientific revolution occur in Europe and not in China or the Arab world, which obtained these technologies and resources earlier? China's four great inventions, papermaking, gunpowder, the compass, and printing, did indeed reach Europe. But why did the Chinese not use the principles of gunpowder to develop modern chemistry? Why did they not use the compass to launch the age of discovery? Why did printing in China mainly serve to copy Buddhist scriptures and civil examination materials, while in Europe it triggered the Reformation and an explosion of knowledge? The answers to these questions cannot be explained merely by network position. They involve more complex factors of institutions, culture, religion, and political structure. Frankopan's network historiography is invincible when explaining flow, but appears inadequate when explaining innovation and breakthrough. He portrays Europe as a lucky end user, but ignores the profound transformations occurring within Europe itself: the rise of universities, the establishment of corporate systems, the methodology of experimental science, the evolution of property rights protection. These are the true cornerstones of modernity. Fourth, the cost of fragmented narrative history becomes a collage. Frankopan's structure, organizing the book by roads, gives it a unique rhythm, but also creates a serious problem: fragmentation. The book jumps from antiquity to modernity, from religion to trade, from the Black Death to oil. Each chapter is an independent theme, and between chapters there is a lack of coherent causal chains. After reading a chapter on the Mongol Empire, the next suddenly jumps to the 19th century Great Game. Though this thematic narrative avoids dry chronologies, it also deprives history of its depth. Durant's The Story of Civilization, though voluminous, has a clear thread in each volume: Greek rationality, Roman rule of law, medieval faith, Renaissance, humanism. Readers can follow this thread and watch a civilization germinate, mature, and decline. Frankopan's book is more like a collage. Every frame is brilliant, but what is the relationship between them? How did the Silk Road network evolve from ancient land routes to modern sea routes? How did the rise of maritime trade change Central Asia's position? These questions are cut into fragments in the book, and readers must piece them together themselves. For readers accustomed to traditional universal history narratives, this fragmentation can be a challenge. You finish the book, remembering many brilliant fragments, yet find it difficult to form a holistic picture of how world history evolved. Fifth, the ghost of geographical determinism. Although Frankopan does not openly preach geographical determinism like Jared Diamond, his narrative is similarly permeated by a kind of geographical fatalism. He seems to imply, because Central Asia lies at the center of the Eurasian landmass, it must inevitably be the world's hub. Because the Middle East possesses oil, it must inevitably be the focus of modern great power rivalry. Because China sits at the eastern end of the Silk Road, it must inevitably play a central role in the Belt and Road Initiative. But history tells us that geography is the stage, not the script. The same geography, under different institutional and technological conditions, can produce completely different stories. Before the 15th century, the Atlantic was the edge of civilization. After the 15th century, it became the center of the world. Before the 19th century, Middle Eastern oil was worthless. After the 20th century, it became black gold. Geography did not change. What changed were technology, institutions, and human choices. Frankopan sometimes overemphasizes the inevitability of geography, while underestimating humanity's ability to change the meaning of geography. Station 9. How to read this book correctly. Treat it as a key, not a map. Having said so much in criticism, should we deny the value of this book? Absolutely not. The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, is a landmark work. For the first time, it made English-speaking general readers realize world history does not begin with Greece, nor end with America. Central Asia is not the edge of civilization, but its crossroads. Connection is not an accessory of history, but its main thread. But we need to learn to use it correctly. First, treat it as a supplement, not a replacement. Frankopan's historiography is a supplement to Durant-style, vertical historiography, not a replacement. When reading the Silk Roads, you should simultaneously read a book focused on the internal evolution of civilization, a Durant's The Story of Civilization, Kenneth Clark's Civilization, or even Hendrik van Loon's The Story of Mankind. Only then can you see both the connection and the soul of civilization. Second, maintain vigilance against materialism. When you read Frankopan explaining everything through trade and currency, remember to remind yourself, history is not merely a function of economics. Religious fervor, artistic impulse, philosophical inquiry, and the lust for power, these irrational factors also drive history. Frankopan excels at explaining why merchants went there, but not at explaining why saints died there. Third, maintain immunity to centrism. Frankopan flips the map and places Central Asia at the center. But do not fall into another centrism, believing that Central Asia is the true center and Europe merely the periphery. The truth of history is, there is no eternal periphery and no eternal center. Athens was once peripheral, later became central. Rome was once central, later became ruins. New York is central today, but may not be tomorrow. Centers are fluid, the result of historical strategic interaction, not geographical destiny. Fourth, ask, what happened after the connection? Frankopan excels at showing what reached where, but readers should ask, what happened after it reached? When Arabs received Greek philosophy, they did not simply translate Aristotle from Greek into Arabic. They reinterpreted Aristotle through an Islamic theological framework, creating Avicenna and Averroes. This creative transformation is the most brilliant part of civilizational exchange, and also a relatively weak part of Frankopan's book. Fifth, treat history as a question, not an answer. Frankopan's book poses a great question. If we look at the world from the perspective of the Silk Road, what do we see? But he does not give a final answer. The purpose of reading this book is not to accept his conclusions, but to be inspired by his questions, and then to read more books and form your own judgments. Terminus. After flipping the map, what do we see? Reviewing Frankopan's world history from the road of faith to the road of slaves, from the Mongol Empire's supernetwork to the Black Death's train of death, from the silver of Potosí to the black gold of the Persian Gulf, what we see is not merely a flipped map, but a new method of understanding the world. Durant allows us to see the depth of civilization. Every civilization is a bottomless mine, containing philosophy, art, law, and faith, inquiries into justice, and longing for beauty. Frankopan allows us to see the connection of civilization. No mine is an island. They are connected to one another through countless invisible tunnels, exchanging oxygen, ore, and heat, but also exchanging germs, violence, and fear. In today's era of decoupling, confrontation, and barriers, Frankopan's reminder is especially precious. The golden ages of human civilization were never eras when one civilization dominated the world, but eras when different civilizations bravely connected, openly traded, and learned from one another. The Mongol Empire was brutal, but it opened roads. Arab merchants were profit-driven, but they spread numerals and algebra. Venetians were shrewd, but they allowed Eastern wisdom to flow into the West. But we must also remember Frankopan's blind spots. Connection brings not only dividends, but also costs. Trade brings not only mutual benefit, but also exploitation. Networks bring not only openness, but also control. When we praise the prosperity brought by the Silk Road, we must not forget the backs of slaves. When we marvel at the mobility of the Mongol Empire, we must not forget the massacred populations of sacked cities. When we look toward the future of the Belt and Road, we cannot avoid the shadows of power, debt, and geopolitical game theory. Perhaps the true purpose of understanding history is not to prove who is superior to whom, but to remind us, we have never been separate. Our ancestors exchanged goods, diseases, gods, and dreams on the Silk Road. Our destinies today are still defined by those ancient connections, and shaped by the new connections we choose to build or sever. Frankopan writes an unforgettable sentence in the book's preface: "The world that we think we see depends on where we stand when we are looking at it." Thank you for listening to today's deep reading. Flipping the map is not for the sake of negating the past, but for seeing a more complete truth. I am Lawrence Stardust. See you next time.